All right. Um, I'm sure people will still be trickling in a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and get this all started. So welcome everybody to this event. My name is Lars, and I'll be speaking a little bit and introducing our main speaker. So without further ado, let's get this underway. So with me, I have Greg Butterfield, Struggle of Lucha co-editor and the coordinator of Solidarity and excuse me, Novorossiya and Antifascists in Ukraine. He has written extensively on developments in Ukraine and Donbass since 2014. In September of that year, he visited Crimea to meet with the exiled Ukrainian activists. When he attempted to visit the city of Kharkov in eastern Ukraine, he was deported at gunpoint. In 2016, he went to Donetsk and Lugansk, attending an anti-fascist conference and visiting the People's Militia near the front line. And many of his articles and translations can be found at Red Star Over Donbass. Welcome, Greg. So the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Lars. And thank you everyone for coming by the webinar this afternoon. For more than 2 months now, there's been a steady drumbeat from the Biden administration and the US corporate media that says Russia is threatening to invade Ukraine. The threat is imminent. It's not a question of if, much less of why, only when. It's presented as a bare statement of fact. No dissenting voices are allowed. The only question up for debate is how strong the response should be. Should it be a direct military response? Is it enough to send in weapons, money, and advisors to Ukraine? What role should negotiations and sanctions play? Right now, 8,500 US-based troops are on alert for deployment to Europe at any time, in addition to the 64,000 that are already stationed there. For those of us who are old enough to remember, it's eerily similar to the buildup to the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003. And just like the weapons of mass destruction story used to justify the US invasion of Iraq, it's a complete lie. The real threat of invasion is not by Russia against Ukraine. It is by Ukraine against the small, independent Donbass republics of Donetsk and Lugansk on Russia's western border. Let me repeat that. The threat of invasion is not coming from Russia. It's from US armed and funded Ukraine. Right now, 125,000 Ukrainian troops, which is half of the country's military, is concentrated along the relatively short border of Donetsk and Lugansk with Ukraine. Washington is pushing for Ukraine to attack Donetsk and Lugansk. Why? The US political establishment, the big banks, big oil, the military-industrial complex, hope this will force a defensive response from Russia that can be used to justify war, harsher sanctions, more military expenditures, and further expansion of the NATO military alliance on Russia's borders. The United States is the motor force of this crisis, not Russia. Russia says it will not invade or start a war. The Donbass republics, which have suffered an 8-year total economic and political blockade and a long conflict with Ukraine that's cost 14,000 lives, they don't want more war. Ukraine's President Zelensky and the oligarchs of Ukraine hate Russia and want to conquer Donbass. But even they are terrified of what will happen if the US succeeds in pushing them into a war right now. Ukraine's 2015 invasion of Donbass was roundly defeated by the local people's militias and internationalist volunteers. The Ukrainian army is better trained and armed now, thanks to NATO, but Zelensky knows they're no match for the combined forces of Donbass and Russia. Germany the European Union's biggest economic power, doesn't want war either. Germany needs Russian gas and heating oil to keep flowing to fuel its economy. The German capitalists know that if there's war, they'll be forced to buy from US oil companies at greatly inflated prices. The same is true for the rest of Western Europe. All of these countries, all of these peoples are pawns in a deadly game that only benefits US imperialism. The US rulers created this crisis and continue to pour fuel on the fire day by day. So why now? I've lost count over the last 7 or 8 years how many times there have been stories circulated in the Western media. Sometimes they started in Ukraine, sometimes they started in Washington, sometimes in other places, claiming that a Russian invasion was imminent. And usually these would fade away after a week or two. This is the most sustained propaganda campaign against Russia on this issue in all that time, really, since 2014. And it's coming directly from the top in Washington and on Wall Street. So why now? The global capitalist system is in crisis. It was spiraling toward recession even before the pandemic struck 2 years ago. And while some billionaires and sectors have profited handsomely from the COVID crisis, US imperialism's overall profit and strategic dominance are threatened at every turn. In particular, we can look at the oil industry, which is thoroughly entwined with the biggest US banks, with the military industrial complex, which has been in crisis for over a decade now. Oil and gas prices never rebounded to the heights they reached before the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. That's why Obama, then Trump, and now Biden have targeted oil producers like Venezuela, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, and of course Russia, with blockades, sanctions, and war to stem the flow of oil and gas from those countries. US capitalists are desperate to stop the nearly completed Nord Stream 2 pipeline slated to bring Russian gas to Europe, because the US is desperate to regain and enhance its share of oil profits, oil and gas profits. There is one other group that's eager for war. It's the neo-Nazi groups like Right Sector, the Azov Battalion, Patriots of Ukraine, and C-14, which have run rampant since the US engineered coup that overthrew the democratically elected government in 2014. Those groups have been fully integrated into Ukraine's military and security apparatus. According to official sources and activists in Donbass, neo-Nazi battalions have been deployed to towns and villages on the ceasefire line separating Ukraine from Donetsk and Lugansk. These fascists speak of the residents of that region as cattle and insects and routinely call for genocide to recapture the region. In the event of a Ukrainian invasion, they will form the spearhead. The US is truly playing with fire in Eastern Europe right now. Even if, despite all the buildup of weapons and mobilization of troops, calmer heads somehow prevail in the Pentagon, and Biden gives the order to pull back or slow down the attack, there's no guarantee that these neo-Nazis, who are now armed with NATO weapons and training, will obey. Likely they'll feel that Biden has betrayed them, as they're now also saying about Zelensky. Why is the Biden administration collaborating with neo-Nazis? Ukraine was occupied by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The inspiration of the modern day fascists is a creep called Stepan Bandera, who collaborated with the Nazis. Today's Ukrainian government recognizes Bandera as a national hero, while banning the symbols and organizations of communists and socialists. After the war, the United States nurtured the Ukrainian Nazis, both in Ukraine and largely outside of it in Canada and the US and other places, as a weapon against the Soviet Union, just as Nazis were recruited for NATO and for the US war machine after the war. So there's a very long history there of US collaboration with the Ukrainian Nazi movement. You won't see it in any of the current media war propaganda, but over the past few years, several articles have broken through in the media here that have documented how the US and European white supremacists have gone to Ukraine to train with these groups, these same groups that are receiving arms and training from the Pentagon and from other NATO countries. Some of those fascists from the US have participated in Ukraine's war against Donbass. And the FBI even admitted a couple of years ago that a group that was involved in the Charlottesville fascist riot where Heather Heyer was murdered had trained with Ukrainian Nazis before that event. I think we should, keep this point in mind and encourage people who voted for Biden, who have questions about this, who voted for Biden as an alternative to Trump's white supremacist program, to demand answers from him on this issue. I want to say a little bit about what we must do to oppose the US war drive. At this moment, the most important thing we can do is show visible opposition to US war with Russia. We need people to go out in the streets with signs, banners, and leaflets, organize car caravans, do social media blasts. The more the better, while of course we're wearing masks and taking all the necessary health precautions for the pandemic. And not just in DC or New York, but all over the country in cities and towns, large and small. That's why the Struggle to Lucha and the Socialist Unity Party are joining with other groups to call for national days of action from February 4th through 12th to say, no war on Russia and Donbass, US NATO out of Ukraine. Baltimore, San Diego, New York, Detroit, New Orleans, and Minneapolis are among the places already planning activities. The call for days of action is being announced publicly today, and we hope to add more locations soon. Wherever possible, we should be encouraging existing anti-war groups to endorse and join with them in any actions that they may announce. Those of us with experience in the US movement are well aware of the rivalries and sectarianism that exists among some of these groups, many of which have existed since the time of the Iraq War. These are long-term issues that we need to work on as a movement. But right now, the most important thing is to make opposition to war with Russia visible and stand shoulder to shoulder with anyone who is opposed to it, on a progressive basis. The George Floyd uprising, we should remember, was just a year and a half ago. The capitalist rulers of the United States have certainly not forgotten it. Taking to the streets is the best way to raise the specter of that uprising in their minds and give them pause on their drive toward war. Finally, I want to address the problem of how we can reach out to poor and working people on this issue. How do we talk to our family members, coworkers, and neighbors? One big hurdle we have to overcome is that there's very little understanding among people in the US about Eastern Europe and the former Soviet countries. Through no fault of their own, many people in the US cannot identify Ukraine on a map, and most have probably not even heard of Donetsk and Lugansk. If people have any impression of Russia, it's most often old Cold War anti-communist stereotypes. US war propaganda plays off of these stereotypes, despite the fact that socialism was overthrown and the Soviet Union broken up 3 decades ago. explaining what's actually happening with Ukraine, Russia, and Donbass, educating people about the role of the US and NATO in Europe is very necessary. But we should be realistic in the fact that it's a longer term goal. It may not grab people's attention out on the street or get them to take a leaflet or consider joining a protest. However, we can get people's attention by connecting the war danger to the current conditions and concerns of their daily lives. Right now, hundreds of thousands of families across the country are facing eviction as the pandemic eviction moratoriums end. But the Biden administration's priority is war with another nuclear armed power on the other side of the world. Congress can't manage to pass the Build Back Better's modest social and infrastructure measures, but there was overwhelming bipartisan support for the Pentagon's $768 billion annual budget passed last month. Biden and Harris have not met any of their campaign promises to curb racist police brutality. In fact, they've been promising more money to cops since they got into office. But they're also collaborating with white supremacist movements abroad. One thing I've seen a lot of people comment on social media recently, which I think is very good, is many people have been making the point that these huge shipments of weapons and supplies from the US have been arriving almost daily in Ukraine for like the last 10 days. Even as before, most people receive their 4 meager home COVID tests from the government by mail. This is an example that really shines a spotlight on the skewed politics of the US government at a time when everyone can see the utter collapse of public health in this country. So in that spirit, we're working to develop attractive and easy to read flyers that talk about these issues and connect them to the war danger, which can be used for leafleting at actions in the coming weeks. We'll be making these available for download in the next few days. The articles we publish on strugglelalucha.org also have a ton of helpful facts and information that people can use to develop their own local flyers and talking points. So hold a picket line, have a banner drop, give out leaflets at your subway stop or school, notify the local media, participate in social media blasts, take photos and videos and share them online with us. Every action we take right now makes a difference. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg. That was wonderful. That was Greg Butterfield, who, again, coordinator of solidarity with Novorossiya and anti-fascists in Ukraine. Great talk. Yeah. There's been, I know a lot of people have been noticing all of the war drum, banging of the war drum regarding everything going on with Russia and Ukraine. And everything you said, I think really relevant. A lot of people don't know what's really been going on over there. They have been noticing that the government has been spending a lot on military and not hardly anything on pandemic relief. Really skewed priorities, I think. And, I'm very glad that you brought the attention to all of that. My name is Lars. I am with Struggle Lucha, as well as Youth Against War and Racism. And right now, it is 5:21, and we have plenty of time for questions from all of you. So right now, Q&A is open, as well as chat. And so if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask Greg, please go ahead and type that into the box down below. You should see it in your Zoom app or Zoom software little toolbar there down at the bottom, and I'll get to them. And It looks like we do have. Gloria wants to know that she signed in at 2:05 Pacific time. She wants to know how much she missed. Gloria, this is all being recorded, correct? Yes. All of this is being recorded, and you will be have access to the vid after this. So not to worry, you'll be all set to go on that. We have some things coming in here from chat. Lots of similar sentiment from chat about how good the talk was. Maggie says that LA is organizing for the Days Against the US war with Russia too, and thank you, very helpful. Thank you, Maggie. We have Bill Doors, who says brilliant and concise. I agree. Thank you, Bill. We have Tova Fry, who says that was a very helpful and informative talk. Thanks, Greg. Is there a link to share for groups who might want to endorse or announce? I believe there is. Yeah, I believe there is.
We have the statement posted now on the Struggle of Lucha website. Folks can, and we have an event page set up on Facebook, which we'll be getting out. We do need to add a email link to the statement that people can use to endorse, and I'll make sure that happens after the event today.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And Maggie also adds that from John, such a great way to deliver an understandable, digestible talk that links the issues with the most oppressed of our class. Again, couldn't agree more. We do have one comment here from Diane earlier on, who said, no one voted for Biden, we voted against Trump, which, yeah, I think there's a lot of sentiment that was essentially what happened this election, right? A lot of folks looked at the two choices and went, well, we got to get the one guy out of office, and now we got this, and the struggle continues. So we have two questions here in Q&A. Oh, now 30. So I'll go from top to bottom here. We have Sam Lewis, who wants to know about the identities of some of these white supremacist groups and asks, what are the names of the white supremacist neo-Nazi groups that Biden is helping to fund? Do we have the, you mentioned, I believe, a couple of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wide web of different groups that, and just like the fascist groups that exist here in the United States, they're often at war with themselves as well as with
very true.
Everyone else. Some of the more prominent ones right now, I mean, the Azov Battalion is probably the most famous in terms of its role as both as on the front line of the war in Donbass since very early on, is well known for flying, flags with fascist regalia, and is well known for being the first openly fascist group that was fully integrated into the Ukrainian army and the arms and the military structure of the country, and received and continues to receive weapons and training from the West on that basis. And there are others that have followed them, but they're the best known. Several years ago, there was an attempt by a couple of more progressive people in Congress to highlight the fact that this U.S. money and weapons was going to this group, and they actually managed to get like a non-binding statement passed in the House, I think. Unfortunately, it never had any effect, and it was like completely wiped out the next time that the funding was voted for Ukraine. in Congress, but there have been, some exposés of these groups. One of the more violent ones in recent years, which is also involved, is something called C14, which came to prominence a couple of years ago when they led raids against Roma communities in Western Ukraine, and actually killed one or two people and really terrorized the whole community. So, these are, and there are also, groups that are, have a little bit more of a veneer of respectability, despite having these politics. And they, these are the folks who were seen shaking hands with people like John McCain and Christopher Dodd back in 2014, 2013, when the coup happened. And they are, prominent players in Ukrainian national politics, and sort of set the tone of, the current regime with its bans on socialist and communist symbols, banning of the Communist Party from participating in political life, running, revolutionary groups like Borotba underground or, into exile. And so it's, it's very pervasive. They're benefiting and from Washington's largesse, and Washington is benefiting from them having this, prominent role in the country. It's, it's no exaggeration to say that these folks, they literally, call for genocide against the residents of Donetsk and Lugansk. They want to cleanse as they say, cleanse the Russian speakers and other multinational residents of those regions out, and have it be purely Ukrainian territory again.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. We have a number of questions here. There is one that, if you don't mind, I think I can answer here. We have, can Struggle Lucha help with literature or signage if someone wants to, in another area, wants to organize something? Yes. Yeah, we can definitely help out with that. If you need to get into contact with us, you have our Facebook, you have our, I believe, Struggle Lucha, yep, webpage. Yep, so yes, please do get in contact with us, and we will do our best to assist with that wherever possible. We have a number of questions here. Oh, excuse that, outside. There we go. I'll move over to this one here. This is a very interesting one, I think, so I'd like to hear your opinion on it, Greg. 8 years ago, the US instigated the overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine during the Russian Olympics. So do you think there's a risk of major US provocation against China during the Beijing Olympics, such as the rulers of Taiwan claiming independence, terror attacks, Hong Kong protests, or US allies building bases on contested islands, while China would be reluctant to take action because of the Olympics? Essentially, do you think that the Olympics might play a role in something going down in the future?
Well, that's certainly always possible. I mean, the US has a history of looking for times that are distracting. Around holidays, for example, I remember back in 1989 when I was, just getting my feet wet in the anti-war movement, George Bush the First, ordered the invasion of Panama right before Christmas in 1989, when people were traveling and, it was hard to respond quickly to it. So I think in this case with the Olympics, certainly that's an international event that a lot of people are paying attention to, and could either serve as a distraction for something to happen in another part of the world, in Europe, for example, on the Russian border, or as you were suggesting, as a time for further provocations against China, which is the other big target of ongoing U.S. Aggression right now. And certainly, there's always that danger, and we should be keeping a close eye on that situation. It's hard sometimes to focus on one crisis that U.S. imperialism is causing in one part of the world, because there are so many going on at the same time. I mean, there's the campaign against China, there's always the machinations against Venezuela and Cuba and other countries in Latin America that are trying to maintain their independence. Of course, in the Middle East, I mean, we just saw this huge murderous attack in Yemen last week, carried out by Saudi Arabia, technically, but they're flying US planes with US trained pilots shooting US weapons. So, is it just Saudi Arabia? No, it's a US war being fought by their proxies, just like it has been in Ukraine over the last 8 years. It really speaks to the fact that we need to revitalize the anti-war movement as a whole in this country and root it more in the working class and the oppressed communities, so that it can sustain itself. And I hope that, one of the things, whatever happens in the coming days and weeks with regard to Ukraine and Russia and the Donbass, I hope that this can be a step towards revitalizing that movement and getting some new unity around all the countries that are under attack.
Thanks, Greg. We have a number of questions here regarding NATO. I'm going to speak on both of them right now, and Greg, you can go ahead and give your opinions on those. Andre Powell asks, how are NATO allies of the US reacting to the US maneuvers? And Yusuf in chat says, thank you very much. The struggle against NATO, it has in the past galvanized the militant worldwide anti-imperialist struggle. NATO is an offensive imperialist alliance at the service of the US imperialism. NATO should be abolished, and I feel that this is an important issue. Any comments?
Yeah, I'm glad that both of those folks raised NATO. One of the points in our call to action for the days of protests in February is to abolish NATO, as well as to withdraw all US troops from Europe. And it's very important. I mean, one of the key points in the so-called negotiations, which are very one-sided between the US and Russia over the past couple of weeks, is Russia's demand, which they've made many times over the years, for the US to live up to its pledge at the end of the Cold War, not to expand NATO to the east to Russia's border. And of course, the US has never abided by that pledge. At least 14 countries have joined NATO since the end of the Cold War. Ukraine is one of the ones, it's not an official member yet, but that's like a red line for Russia, because Ukraine has the longest contiguous border with Russia, Russia's western border. And it's obviously very dangerous for Russia's continued sovereignty if NATO is literally on its border that way. One of the things that fueled the coup in 2014 in Ukraine was that the US really wanted to grab the strategic military base on the Crimean Peninsula. Crimea had historically been part of Russia, but during Soviet times, during a period of when they were rationalizing different aspects of the economy, it was decided that Ukraine would take possession of the Crimean Peninsula. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine signed a long-term lease, basically, on the military base on the Black Sea, saying, Russia can maintain its military base there as a, strategic, protective, defensive outlet for both countries. But when the coup happened in 2014, the US wanted to move in and take that strategic base for NATO. And the people in Crimea rejected that. They didn't want the right-wing coup that was trying to outlaw the Russian language, which was the majority there spoke. And they voted overwhelmingly to return to Russia. And Russia accepted that and took possession of the Crimean Peninsula again. And the US has never forgiven them for that. Even today, 8 years later, it's brought up constantly that Russia invaded Crimea or something like that, which is not at all what happened. It was a democratic process. Just as the vote by the people in Donetsk and Lugansk for independence after the coup was a democratic process. But the US, of course, doesn't recognize that. So NATO positioning in Ukraine is a very key point. There are other NATO members on Russia's western border, particularly the Poland and the Baltic states, which are small states, but they're all headed by extreme right-wing or even neo-Nazi leaderships that are subservient to Washington. Within NATO, there's really a growing division, I think, between the Western European imperialist powers like Germany and France, which are part of NATO, which go along with the anti-Russia rhetoric, but really aren't. They know that war with Russia is not in their interest. They're more interested in continuing trade, and particularly in getting the gas and oil at a affordable rate from Russia. And they know that the US is using them as pawns in this process. And then among the more recent additions to NATO are mostly, Eastern European countries that used to have socialist governments before 1990 and are now ruled by ultra right-wing regimes that are completely, subservient to Washington and are, very much anti-Soviet, anti-Russia, willing to do anything to help the US provoke the situation, which also makes it very dangerous. I mean, right before the current campaign claiming that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, people may remember back in early November, there was a crisis in Belarus. Belarus is a small country that's aligned with Russia. It actually has a pretty progressive government that's held on to a lot of the gains of Soviet times compared to other Soviet republics, former Soviet republics. And they were what happened was that there were immigrants, migrants and refugees from the Middle East, from the wars of the US in the Middle East, who had come to Belarus because they wanted to cross the border into Poland to get to the European Union for asylum and residence there. And Poland drew the line hard down on the Belarus border, started attacking migrants at the border, threatened military action against Belarus. And it wasn't until after a few weeks, it was clear the US was egging this on, again, as a way to try to block oil and gas from coming from Russia, because there's a major pipeline that goes through Belarus to Western Europe. And what happened was that Germany intervened kind of at the last minute to calm things down. And immediately the US shifted gears towards Ukraine at that point. So it's all of the NATO and wannabe NATO stooges along the Russian border are playing a role in this process. And it's very important to realize that a provocation could come from any one of those countries as well. As for building a anti-NATO movement, I think that's really key. And I was reminded recently that, it was exactly 10 years ago that there was the big mobilization in Chicago against the NATO summit that was held there in 2012, where a number of people were arrested. Some folks were framed up on serious heavy charges and jailed for a long time for protesting NATO in Chicago. And we really need to rebuild that that movement and that awareness of what NATO's role is. It is, as you said, as the commenter said, it's a aggressive imperialist entity. It always has been. It was set up originally to counter the socialist camp after World War II. There was no, in terms of what it was set up to do, there was no reason for it to continue to exist after the fall of the Soviet Union, and yet it has grown year by year. And even one of the more ridiculous things is that even the far-right government in Colombia in Latin America has been added to NATO, even though it's thousands of miles away on a different continent. That's how much that they want to invest in uniting all of these forces.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and thanks to everybody who brought up the stuff about NATO. I see a lot of talk about the imperialist actions of the US in chat and in the Q&A, and also a couple more things here. We have Christopher Fry, who says that China's official statement indicates the blame for the Ukraine situation is entirely due to the expansion of NATO, which, yeah. There is one anonymous attendee who says, shouldn't NATO have been disbanded after the Soviet socialist blocs collapsed? Instead, it was continued and expanded. Yeah, again, I think we really see, where the actual priorities of a lot of these countries lie regarding the, imperialist causes of the US and whatnot. I want to get through as many of these questions as I can. I think we're going to have time for one or two more. So, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and read off this one. This one is sent in from Maggie, but it comes also in from Comrade John Parker, who is in Honduras at the moment for Xiomara Castro, her inauguration in Honduras. And he asks, how can we build a more united anti-war movement that builds and is inclusive and respects the power and potential of movements for Black lives and anger over Biden's Trump-like immigration policies? I think that's a very good question. And also, does the change in Honduras a defeat by the Honduran people against US imperialism, so a win for the Honduran people, create a teachable moment for other victims of US imperialism?
Well, taking the second point first, I mean, yes, our friends and comrades in the Donbass republics have always said any victory around the world against US imperialism is a victory for them, and gives them hope, when they see the People's Movement in Honduras electing Xiomara Castro and being able to fend off all of these machinations that are going on behind the scenes to try to undo her election. It's inspiring for them and for people everywhere. Seeing Cuba hold on and advance despite the blockade and the cruel way that the Biden administration has continued to use COVID as a weapon against Cuba, even as Cuba is helping the world to fight COVID. All of these things are really helpful. I've been doing this work since 2014, and it's often, difficult to keep it going because, again, as we mentioned, there's not a lot of momentum or information about it, even in the anti-war movement in the US. And it's only moments like this when the crisis flares up that people pay it a lot of attention. But it's really I've learned that even small actions and acts of solidarity mean a lot to very isolated struggles like those. So you can bet that when we have our week of actions, when people are taking to the streets against a US war on Russia and Donbass, people over there are going to be paying attention. And as much as we might like to be having bigger actions right away, it's still important. We shouldn't, discount it, even if we're, a handful of people with banners or a car caravan or just giving leaflets out, talking to people in our community. It does make a difference. And I think that's really the key. I mean, it's a big job, what John was saying about trying to rebuild the anti-war movement and making it more sustainable and more equitable and more, part of the communities, the working class communities. Historically, and we can look at the Russian Revolution of 1917 as a perfect example that, the working class, in its struggles for higher wages, for better conditions against repression at home, has also been the key element in fighting against wars and stopping wars. The Russian Revolution was the biggest factor in ending the First World War. So it's really important, I think, that we find a way to reconnect the anti-war struggle with Black Lives Matter, with the immigrant rights struggle, with the struggles around housing and healthcare and COVID, so that these aren't seen as, as they often are, I think, in the US movement these days, as these very separate kind of things. It's almost weird sometimes to see a organization or a movement like ours that tries to bring those things together, and we have to overcome that and really make it a part of all of our daily work to unite the struggles here with the struggle against war, especially nowhere more so than here in the U.S., because the U.S. is the U.S. imperialists are the biggest source of war in the world. You know, the military bases, the weapons sales, and you know, just continually meddling in the elections and political life of countries on every continent. So it's really important that we do that, and I think, you know, this can be a good first step, showing in practice how we think it should be, by going, you know, to our communities and our coworkers and fellow students and so on, and talking about these issues and drawing the connections between, you know, how the U.S. government is spending all this money, putting all these logistics into shipping arms and weapons, but they're not, you know, they're not helping to vaccinate the world. They're not helping to keep people off the streets here. They're not helping make it easier for workers at Amazon or other places that are fighting for their right to unionize. Just lip service at the most. So, you know, again, I hope that, you know, we can really set a good example going forward with this movement, on connecting the dots, for helping people connect the dots about what's happening overseas and what's happening here.
I think that was a great answer. Yes, thank you, Greg. There's a couple of comments here from Bill, who says, I hope we can circulate this talk wildly. It's very clear and concise explanation. Yep, I agree. And I hope we do too. Cheryl in chat says, when Greg spoke about the arms shipments, I thought about the environmental costs too. Isn't the US military monster with 800 plus bases around the world the big polluter too? Yes, it absolutely is. And I think that ties hand in hand with what you were saying, Greg, about really connecting these things. It's you've got the COVID situation and the current militarism of the United States, and also you've got, you know, the United States imperialism not only, you know, really damaging the sovereignty of all of these foreign nations, but also, you know, polluting up the storm. So I think that was a great point to make. We have a couple more things, and I think we can get all of these done in one fell swoop. I think this is going to be our last little question session here. We have from Anonymous, who wants to know, what are some sources of breaking news on Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk that you would recommend? And another anonymous attendee who wants to know if there's a cumulative list of actions being taken. So I'll go ahead and let you take those two, Greg.
Okay. Well, there are some good sources on Donetsk and Lugansk, but one of the challenges that I faced when I started doing this work around the time of the coup in 2014 is that it's very hard to find anything in English that wasn't filtered through the US propaganda lens. And I sort of learned to translate a lot of material, and have continued to do that over the years, although recently I haven't been able to keep up with it as much as I would like. But there are now from Donetsk and Lugansk, you know, official news sites that have English language sections, which are helpful. The Donetsk News Agency and the Lugansk Media Center. And I'll try to put those in the chat before we end, the links to those. As far as, I'm sorry, I lost the other point. What was it?
There was
What was the other question?
yeah, there was a question about the, if there was gonna be a list of all of the actions being
Oh,
taken, somewhere.
yes, I think Clova earlier put the link to the Facebook page for the events in the chat. We're going to be listing all of the events on that page, certainly, and you can send, if you're having an event, send it to that page, and we'll add it. But I assume that local groups will set up their own Facebook events, but then we also want to have a central place where we can see everything that's happening. So we'll be adding to that list as more things come in, and again, encourage people to do whatever they can, even if you're you're a couple of people leafleting in your neighborhood, and you want us to list it. I think that would be great. We want to encourage people to do activities large and small.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Greg. I think everybody, I can speak for a lot of people here in chat when I say that this has been a very informative talk. So thank you so much for everything that you've been talking about today. And there is one comment here that I want to leave off with. It's from Lee Patterson here in chat, who says, Dr. Martin Luther King said this was the most violent government, and I'm saying that the Pentagon is the biggest threat to humanity. The fascists are at home in the US, and our taxes pay for them, their nuclear war insanity. Yeah, it's wild, and I know that just the idea of war, a lot of people here in the country are very detached from the truth of what goes on overseas, and also it's a scary thing thinking about what could possibly happen later on down the line. But like, I know that for me personally, like when 9/11 occurred and all of the fallout from that was happening, I was very young, but I'm old enough to remember about how drastic, the real movement was to sort of, get the military out there. And there was a huge, swell of really anti-war sentiment around all of that. And I think absolutely one of the best things that we can do is to really, get out there and really, get people informed. And we all need to be out there to really do our best to prevent any sort of horrible, foreign war escalation, here and abroad. So thank you so much again, Greg. I think we all really appreciated your talk. And I
Thanks,
think,
everyone.
awesome. Yeah, and I think that's going to conclude our webinar. So thank you everybody so much for coming in and asking questions, and we'll be signing off now. So thanks again.